Your mother got a wooden leg with a kickstand, motherfucker.
Y'all ever hear this mother joke where it's like, your mama's so tall, she did a backflip and kicked Jesus in the mouth? For years, I'd misinterpreted that one. I was thinking of history as this horizontal timeline, and that instead of going vertical, the mother's body was stretching backwards in time. But what if this horizontal mother actually existed in our own time, and that this kind of time traveling was his whole life's work? In 1870, the French writer Theodore de Banville had received a letter from a 17-year-old who asked the older poet if he'd read some of his work, which would turn out to be of such genius that Banville immediately got flushed down the toilet of history. And then in 1995, Guy Davenport received a package from a young translator named Wyatt Mason, who'd gone to France and asked around who'd be considered the greatest writer there at the time. And the answer was always Pierre Michon, who Davenport wasn't familiar with, but after reading some was like, damn, this is some good shit. Not to say that Michon could be properly translated. He paints with these long purple strokes flecked with copper and gold and seared by this arcane sauce voluptuously bursting in your mouth, the taste of which even the most well-read of us might feel is pretentious.
Oh, check it out.
In this collection here, he paints a portrait of another well-known figure, Vincent van Gogh, as seen through the eyes of his friend Joseph Rouland, who, unlike Rimbaud, it wasn't clear if Van Gogh had any talent, but rather that he was randomly lifted up by the wealthy after his death. It's almost like Michon wants to do the same, and the subjects of his portraiture become even more obscure. And what struck me the most, though, in this collection is this piece called The King of the Wood, where a peasant boy hiding in the grass one day sees a royal carriage pull up, and a woman rush out toward him, turning around, lifting up her skirt, squatting down, and pissing right in front of him as this prince laughs at her from his carriage. I don't know, I get this image actually of a buggy, one of those Mennonite buggies whose wheels are tall and thin. They wobble slightly. Thin spokes of the thin wheels, pinstriping on the spokes. Green pinstriping, finesse of the designs. Infinite finesse of the designs. On thin black spokes. Designs on the limbs of the clouds. Finesse of the designs. Green pinstriping, finesse of the designs. Finesse of the designs. Green pinstriping, thin wheels and black designs themselves. On the limbs of the infinite finesse of the designs. Refined designs on thin black spokes, infinite finesse of the designs, finesse of the designs, fine green pinstriping on the spokes. Almost like all this is just an occasion for him to go off on his own poetic flights that seem to almost compete or even surpass the source material. But then over time, the source material becomes even more marginal. Others have done the opposite with their portraiture, chosen subjects and sung about them in the flattest way possible, who themselves also sang about the lives of others, sifting through pieces of the past. It's all about selecting your own shots using the same legendary frame. Some hit more flat, some hit with more spin. Then somewhere along the way, Michon switched to using a computer to compose, and the results here, not exactly what you'd expect. His writing became even more dry and burlappy, and it's also curious as to why he changes translators so much. It's almost as if one by one they were trying to take their shot and getting dismissed when they fall short. As I was reading this book, really started to feel some resonance with the work of Marcel Schwob, though Schwob fleshes out his stories much more, which for him really aren't stories as he believed writing to be less about creating and more a process of selecting and collaging of existing material. Michon seems to be doing the same, but also heavily cutting out and sometimes shifting the entire frame, which brought to mind the work of Jason Schwartz, who goes even farther. All three of these books sharing a similar cadence. In fact, reading these books together somehow strengthen each other into a more complete work. That's something I like to do, where reading a book is like striking a note. Well, why not bring in other notes to see if they can form a chord, each book being a paragraph of larger work of which you are the composer. And if you're lucky, you can break through and enter the infinite library, where you can simultaneously create and devour infinite literature.
Fantasize what he does and desires. It is said that nothing is beyond him. Calculating, see nothing is beyond him.
come up with an alternate sequence, going from the familiar to the more strange, and then into his imagination, until at last we arrive at the crowning achievement of what was actually his first book, Small Lives. This is where he becomes the subject of his own portraiture. It's like his answer to those who came before and influenced him. We get glimmers into the lives of his ancestors, his childhood growing up, his ambitions, the ugliness of being an artistic Sude, until finally he breaks through. The proof is in the book that we're holding, and then pretty much disappearing from view for the rest of his career. And yet the boy who had been hiding in the grass earlier almost seems to reappear in this, his most overt work of fiction. Also my personal favorite of his, where a young teacher becomes obsessed with a woman who works in the local tobacco shop and happens to also be the mother of one of his students. He worships her from a distance and becomes disturbed when he notices some mysterious marks on her flesh, almost as if someone else was being authored to this work, expressing their darkest desires in the most perverse way possible.
Fucking daydreams. But your muse is eternal. You keep mapping her onto real people, which, you know, in real life you can never possess. In the same way, these monsters can. So you remain hidden, just a fucking lit dweeb no one would look at twice. Just watching and desiring, creating these portraits of others, knowing that in this life you can never be inside that piece of heaven.